Have you ever been in a plane crash? Probably not. Well then, maybe a building fell on you and then you got run over by a car. I doubt it. But the heroes of our video have experienced all of this. And not just once. Most importantly, they survived. Don't believe it? Then watch the video till the end because the last story will surprise you the most. Enjoy watching! I'll start with one of the most famous stories, as its heroine even made it into the Guinness World Records. Vesna Vulovic, a 22-year-old flight attendant from Yugoslavia, was just beginning her aviation career. In 1972, she flew from Stockholm to Belgrade. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The plane was thoroughly checked before takeoff. However, while flying over the German town of Heersdorf, the plane disappeared from radar and exploded in midair 46 minutes after takeoff, splitting into two parts and plummeting from over 30,000 feet. Out of the 28 people on board, only Vesna Vulovic survived. Her body was severely injured, broken legs, ribs, 3 vertebrae, and skull fractures. Fortunately, a former military doctor, Bruno Hanke, was near the crash site. Without him, Vesna's chances of survival would have been close to zero, as the plane's debris was scattered over a vast area, complicating rescue efforts. In one of her interviews, Vesna recalled, "Bruno found that I had a faint pulse and provided first aid. He did everything correctly. For instance, he didn't try to move my body, noticing my broken spine." Recovering from such extensive injuries was a long and arduous process. Despite doctors insisting that Vesna would never walk again, she refused to give up and eventually made a full recovery. Vesna Vulovic's name entered the Guinness World Records for surviving a fall from 33,000 feet, the highest fall from which a person has survived. Now, for a case that seems straight out of science fiction. You've probably seen movies where people are frozen in cryogenic chambers, only to wake up many years later, alive and well. Our scientists can't quite do that yet, but they seem to be getting close. Anna Bogenholm, however, managed to achieve something similar. In 1999, Anna was skiing down a steep slope but lost control and fell into water near a waterfall. Her head and torso were trapped under a thick layer of ice, while her legs and skis remained on the surface. Finding an air pocket between the ice and water, Anna was able to breathe for 40 minutes. However, rescue teams arrived only after 80 minutes, and when they pulled her out, Anna showed no signs of life. She was rushed to a hospital where resuscitation efforts lasted 3 hours. All hope seemed lost, but then a miracle happened. Anna's heart started beating again. At the moment of her rescue, Anna's body temperature had dropped to 56 degrees Fahrenheit, the lowest temperature at which a person has survived. Although she was alive, her body remained paralyzed. Over time, she made a full recovery. Doctors believe she survived because her body entered a hibernation-like state. Interesting to think about why Anna could hibernate? Maybe she has bears in her family tree? Have you ever heard of a speech that saved a former US president? This remarkable story happened on October 14, 1912. When Theodore Roosevelt was about to give a speech in Milwaukee as part of his presidential campaign. By that time, he had already been president twice and was now seeking a third term. Despite his high popularity, Roosevelt had many enemies, and the political battle between Democrats and Republicans was at its peak. During his speech, John Schrank shot Roosevelt with a revolver. The bullet lodged in the president's chest, having struck a steel glasses case and a 50-page copy of his speech in his jacket pocket. The crowd gasped upon hearing the shot. Roosevelt's bodyguards immediately apprehended the assailant. Roosevelt himself initially staggered, but quickly straightened up, smiled, and raised his hat. His aide, Harry Cockums, asked if he was hurt, to which Roosevelt replied, "He just pinched me, Harry." Despite the wound, Roosevelt began his speech with the words, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot. There is a bullet in my body right now." He spoke for 90 minutes despite his injury, only after finishing his spee.
CH, did Roosevelt agree to go to the hospital? Examination showed that the bullet was lodged in his chest muscle without hitting any vital organs. It hadn't penetrated the pleura, and doctors decided it was safer to leave it than to attempt removal. Roosevelt carried the bullet for the rest of his life. When asked about it, he once quipped, "I mind it no more than if it were in my vest pocket." And now, a rather chilly story. Joe Simpson is one of those people who loved climbing mountains from a young age. To celebrate his entry into adulthood, Joe decided on an unusual activity, climbing the unscalable peak of Ciula Grande in the Peruvian Andes. Why unscalable? Because no one had ever climbed it before. The route was considered insanely dangerous and nearly impossible, but young Joe wasn't deterred. By then, our hero had already explored all the Alps and wanted just one thing, to make his mark in mountaineering history. And he did, but not in the way he had planned. Going on this expedition alone would have been suicidal, so Joe found a partner named Simon, who also loved mountains and agreed to join him. The two managed to reach the summit, but statistically, more than 80% of accidents happened during the descent. And their descent didn't start well. First, they got lost, then they were caught in an avalanche, and soon after, they ran out of water. After all this, it seemed the worst was over, but suddenly Joe slipped and fell. He landed badly. His shin bone shattered his knee and went into his thigh. Simon immediately descended to Joe and decided to lower him using ropes. One end was tied to Simon and the other to Joe. In a waltz-like rhythm, they descended lower and lower. But on one descent, the surface ended in a steep slope with a crevasse. Such a section is difficult to traverse even alone, let alone with a heavy load. They couldn't even talk to each other due to the strong wind. After a couple of hours and several descent attempts, Simon realized that the only way for him to survive was to cut the rope. It was an incredibly tough decision, but he saw no other way out. Joe fell over 60 feet and landed right in the crevasse, but he survived and didn't even lose consciousness. Surveying his surroundings, Simpson realized his situation was hopeless. Darkness, cracking ice, and a terrifying wind. It seemed like death was inevitable, but no, Joe wasn't ready to give up. At first, he fell asleep, as if resigning to his fate. But upon waking, he decided to continue descending by crawling on his stomach. In the end, Joe was lucky. The rope was just long enough to reach a vertical crevasse with an exit to the outside. Then Joe crawled for another 2 days, but eventually made it to the camp, losing almost a third of his weight. Full recovery took him more than 2 years. Later, he wrote a book about this ordeal, which was turned into a movie. That's how determination and willpower helped Simpson escape a seemingly hopeless situation. And of course, make his mark in mountaineering history. Now let's talk about science. The well-known researcher Anatoly Bugorsky worked at the Institute of High Energy Physics in 1978. At that time, it housed the largest Soviet particle accelerator. At one point, the machine malfunctioned. The scientists decided to check the state of the machine, and when he bent down, a proton beam passed through his head. It is known that doses from 400 to 1,000 rad are enough to kill a person. Well, Bugorsky received a dose of 200,000 rad through his head. No other person in the world has ever been exposed to such radiation. At that moment, Bugorsky saw a flash that, in his words, was brighter than 1,000 suns, but he felt no pain. The scientist realized he had been exposed to radiation but chose not to tell anyone. Instead, he simply finished his workday as if nothing had happened and waited for symptoms of radiation sickness. That night, he couldn't sleep as he felt the left side of his face swelling significantly, and after a sleepless night, Bugorsky decided to go to the doctor. He was immediately transferred to a specialized radiological hospital in Moscow. Unlike Chernobyl or Hiroshima, where victims were exposed to a much smaller dose over their entire bodies,
Bugorsky received a localized dose. The beam almost burned a hole through the tissues of his head from the back to the nose, but did not affect vital organs such as the gastrointestinal tract or bone marrow. Although the left side of his face was completely paralyzed and he suffered from epileptic seizures, his intellect remained unaffected. It's amazing. Despite such a dose of radiation, Bugorsky is still living in Protvino and is now 82 years old. The next real story, which was even made into a film, happened on April 26, 2003. Aaron Ralston, an experienced climber, went to explore Blue John Canyon alone, without telling anyone about his plans. After parking his pickup, he continued on a mountain bike and then walked after covering 15 miles. Descending into one of the gorges, Aaron got trapped. A large boulder blocking a narrow crevice dislodged and pinned his right hand against the wall. Thus, the man spent more than 5 days trapped by the rock. At first, Aaron tried to free himself using makeshift tools and climbing equipment, but all efforts were in vain. Then he tried to chip away at the rock, but his knife only dulled. Food and water were scarce. There was no mobile signal, and no one knew his whereabouts, ruling out the arrival of rescuers. For 5 days, Aaron endured unbearable pain and cold, barely sleeping. When the water ran out, he began drinking his urine, but even that ended on the 4th day. Soon he started losing consciousness and drifting into delirium. On the 5th day, Aaron realized that his only chance of survival was to amputate his own arm. Using a dull pocket knife, he performed the amputation. Only after this did he manage to reach rescuers. Aaron lost his arm, but saved his life. Compared to life, losing an arm seemed insignificant. In 2010, a movie called 127 Hours was made based on this story. Highly recommended. The next story is probably one of the most incredible in the world. Maybe you've even heard of the luckiest unlucky man on Earth, Frano Selak, who cheated death 7 times. The first disaster happened to him in 1957 when the bus he was on fell into a river. Selak and the driver swam to the shore, escaping with only minor cuts and bruises. In 1962, our hero was on a train that derailed due to a fallen boulder and plunged into the icy Neretva River. Selak broke a window and escaped the car, saving his acquaintance as well. He only suffered a broken arm and hypothermia, while 17 other passengers either froze or drowned. Honestly, after such an incident, I would have stopped using transportation and stayed home, but Frano thought otherwise. In 1963, Selak took his first flight from Zagreb to Rijeka. Near the destination, the plane experienced technical problems and crashed into a mountain. Selak was thrown from the plane from a height of 2,400 feet, but landed in a haystack and survived. With each story, I start doubting the realism of what happened more and more. In 1970, his car caught fire. Selak managed to get out seconds before the flames reached the fuel tank, and a couple of years later, another car trip ended in flames. Hot oil from a faulty fuel pump entered the engine, and flames burst out of the vents. Selak lost most of his hair but remained unharmed. He was certainly born under a lucky star. In 1995, he was hit by a bus in Zagreb. Despite serious injuries, Selak survived, and a year later, his car collided with a truck and was pushed to the edge of a cliff. The car fell about 300 feet down, but landed on a tree, saving his life. These trials were not Selak's last adventures. Deciding to try his luck, he played the lottery and won a jackpot of about 900,000 euros. Can you even imagine that? The main thing is to always be careful and inform your relatives or friends about your plans. By the way, write in the comments which story you liked the most. Personally, I like the one about Frano Selak, who survived 7 disasters and then won almost €1 million in the lottery. And if you also want to earn €1 million, not in a lottery but by showcasing your remarkable skills, I have something to offer. We are looking for scriptwriters, voice actors, editors, and creative producers for our videos. Interested? Then follow the link in the description and apply. Thanks for watching.